Warning! The video you're going to watch now is part of a thesis and an essay. Almost nothing that will be said has the official signature of astronomical science. Therefore, as these are new and purposeful ideas, you could frame this video in the field of science fiction. The author.
When one takes into account the influence of the isolated observer on the interpretation of physical reality, not on reality itself, one can explain the nature of dark energy. Before that, it is necessary to note that we would be facing a conceptual problem when treating any energy as being dark. This is due to the fact that every form of energy is linked to some type of movement, and that this movement depends on the direct measurability of time. Newton's laws, applied to speed, acceleration and forces, depend on motion, and would have no validity for a place in space where time could not be measured. This is the case, for example, with the Sun's future light cone. The light of the Sun needs to overcome this barrier to allow our star to be seen. From this, we are forced to see the Sun itself being replaced by its image, or with the appearance it had 8 minutes ago. When we talk about energy, we also talk about movement. When any type of energy becomes detectable in space-time, therefore, it would cease to be dark, as it has quantized and entered relative and continuous motion. So, there is no way to admit the existence of a dark energy unless it was acting from outside into space-time. For the scientific community, our temporal dimension has only one real side, which is the inside. Nothing would exist outside of here. Dark energy is so called by physicists because it has not yet revealed its presence. Its existence is deduced indirectly by the inflationary theory, as a mysterious force would be predominating over gravity. The dark energy probably continued to act from the darkness, but there would be an interesting way to bridge the chasm. Just take into account the concept of the future light cone of any event. Regardless of whether we are dealing with a subatomic particle or a star, both would have a cone of this type, with the ability to retain time inside of it. This would relate the concept of a cone of light to the uncertainty of the position or speed of the source. The absence of movement at that location in space would prevent you from seeing the light source directly. In the case of Beta Andromeda, its cone of light from the future would retain the light it emits into space for 75 years. As you look at the sky and see the star instantly, it can be said that the 0 point of time would have migrated from the position of the star to your position on Earth. Let's explain it better. Although any star can take a few billion years to reach adulthood, when its light escapes into space, it would not be seen immediately by an observer on Earth. It is assumed that this light should, initially, overcome the immense distances that separate us. If a lucky astronomer were filming a dark area of space, and the light from our star appeared abruptly, he would be elated and conclude that a new star would have just been born. By tracking its light, he could, using the redshift, measure the position of the star in space, and the approximate time that separates us from it in light years. The curious thing is that, from there, the star would continue to shine continuously in the sky. Whenever you raised your head to the sky, it would be spotted instantly. This is because we depend on our memory and the continuous remote tracking of the light of that star. It doesn't matter how long the Beta Andromeda light took to go through the space that separates us before, because if that light is not here, the star will not be seen at the other end. Along with the fixation of the zero time frame in the observer's position, the scattering of the star's light next to him would also promote an inversion in the direction of the arrow of time, which would start to point, in a seemingly continuous way, in the direction of his past. Despite arriving from an earlier moment in time, and from a place in space that is unknown, as is the case with the cone of light of the future of the event, the light seems to be arriving from the celestial dome, and, therefore, from our past. Anyone who follows my videos on YouTube realizes that I try to draw attention to the role of each one of us in the way we interact with the reality around us. The purpose of the videos is not to directly question the laws of physics, although at times it appears to be at odds with them. This is not the focus of the discussion. I think it is important to look for answers also in the celestial sphere, but we would need to make a deeper reflection in the opposite direction, or inwardly. There would be no differences between the infinities of the microscopic world and the macrostructure. What you see on the outside can and should also be on the inside, as the two levels depend on the same remote light tracking process. In a letter sent to Benchley, Newton made it clear to consider that all infinities are equal. An important consequence of placing the zero point of time in the position of the observer and not in the position of the stars would be the direction of action of the forces involved. This is the case with potential energy, since the inversion in the direction of the arrow of time would also be reflected in the orientation of this force, normally related to gravity. If the time zero mark were placed, for example, in the position of the Sun, from where the count of the 8 minutes necessary for sunlight to reach Earth would begin, it would be legitimate to expect the Sun to generate gravity directly, by bending the space around it. This comes from considering that the space would have the same behavior as an elastic strip. When it stretched, the force would point in the opposite direction, or towards the Sun, generating gravity directly. This would pull the Earth and the other planets towards our star. In practice, the two situations are simultaneous. Anyway, the inversion in the direction of the force would put us in the face of the following situation. A. If the Sun could manifest its point of view, it would tell us that instead of pulling the Earth, it would be constantly pushing it away from itself, but that the Earth would insist on approaching it in a secondary acceleration movement within space-time, called gravity. B. If the Earth expressed its opinion, it would say that it and the other planets would be constantly pressing the Sun in the center of its system in space-time, but would find that veiled resistance exerted by the Sun in the opposite direction, a fictitious force compatible with anti-gravity. In this case, the approaching or moving away from the planets, in relation to the Sun, would be being dictated only by the potential elastic energy, which implies that space would always be stretching out of space-time, and never contracting. Gravity would only be a secondary or restorative force, which would cause a planet to tend to fill the void opened up by space itself when stretching. In other words, space would generate inertia independently of the masses. If the potential energy increased outside of here, the pressure of the planets on the Sun would increase in space-time, and they would approach the star, accelerating until they reach their perihelions. In contrast, if there was a drop in potential energy, the pressure would decrease over the center, and the planets would move away in the direction of the aphelion, in delayed motion. The potential energy would tend to be minimal in the aphelion, and null in the infinite. The beauty of this alternative view is that it would explain why, under normal conditions, the planets could not collide with our star, and, likewise, they could not escape into the icy void of the vacuum. In addition, the constant generation of inertia on the part of space, by stretching now more or less, would be in line with the increase in the disorder of the system, in a single direction of the arrow of time. That is, entropy would always increase towards our future. If we had in mind that nothing would exist within the future cone of light of the Sun, that is, before the beginning of the counting of time and the position of the observer, we would conclude that this phase of the potential energy would be fictitious, since it would have an anti-gravity orientation. The Earth and the other planets would not leave their places when moving away, or when approaching the Sun, because the space around them would be stretching in a veiled way. Sometimes, it would stretch more, sometimes it would stretch less, generating more or less negative energy. Dark energy, now, would be the newest nickname for potential elastic energy. It can be said that the dark energy would be an intrinsic and negative movement, as well as time, or that it would be virtually contained within the observer, due to the principle of excluding direct access to what would be in his future. Within space-time, in turn, the potential, gravitational, energy is negative at finite distances, and tends to decay with decreasing distances. If we think of them as spring-set model, used to describe the simple harmonic movement performed by light, but which also applies to space, the spring would be at rest in infinity. There, the potential energy would be nil, and there would be no forces acting on space. When the spring was contracted, the potential energy would decrease its intensity negatively. Note that, in this context, there would be no measurable spring stretching phase, which is the first phase of the simple harmonic motion, and inflationary theories would be in difficulty.